At 4:03, I'll call this work session of the Anchorage School Board to order. Um, Everyone is in attendance except for Member Wilson, who is joining us online. And we will start with item B, a budget discussion. I'll turn it to the superintendent.
Thank you, Mr. President. So today's work session will be facilitated by our Chief Financial Officer, Andy Ratliff, and myself. And at this point, I anticipate that the bulk of this time will be for board member Q&A. And of course, we're happy to reference last week's slides as the board would like. So we'll give Mr. Ratliff a moment to get to the front. As Mr. Ratliff gets seated, Mr. Ratliff, is there any opening statements that you'd like to provide prior to opening up to board Q&A?
I don't believe so. I think we've got all the documents ready. If you want to go back and view some of the slides from the previous work session or any items within the budget book, I have that ready too to share. So yeah, we can just go ahead and open it up for questions.
Member Jacobs.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I was watching a work session of the Fairbanks School Board last night, and I don't remember what time it was, but they went pretty late. And they talked about their budget, and I was just watching as a matter of professional curiosity, and they're baking into their budget cake, if you will, an assumptive $680 BSA increase. And what their administrative staff said is that there was a two-pronged approach for why they were doing that. And the first was that they would like to assume that the state wouldn't cut year over year education funding dollars, even if they fell outside of the foundation formula. And then two, that they aren't utilizing the maximum capacity of fund balance that they have available to balance their structural deficit. And I'm curious if you could walk through, for no other reason than if someone's watching and curious, why differing approaches, right? We've gone in a different direction where we're assumptive, no state revenue and leaning heavily on our fund balance, and then cuts to programs, how we got to where we did. Thanks.
Sure. So historically, we always have built our budget based on what's in state statute, which is the current BSA of 5,960. I recall last year we did add, that modest $100 BSA to restore some programs at this time last year. Essentially, it ended up being the $680, but that's never guaranteed, right? That's just we go by what's in statute, which even then it's technically not guaranteed. And we are going to spend out our fund balance. So if we did get some money back, I don't know where that would go to, but I don't know. It's a hard question to answer, to say what we would do different than Fairbanks, and not know exactly what position they're in.
Something that I'll add is that, to Mr. Ratliff's point, we have no idea what the funding would be from the state. We have no idea when it would come. And if that final number comes very late, and we're incorrect in our assumption, it puts us in a very precarious situation, because by then releasing teachers will not be an option. So we'd have to look very deep into whatever is left within the district, whatever doesn't conflict with collective bargaining agreements, and that would be our very worst case scenario. With that said, I will acknowledge that Juneau School District seems to also be projecting $400. So there does seem to be pros and cons. But the thing that I would caution the board about is that we have two different bills right now on school funding. One of them would be House Bill 69, which we're very familiar with, which would very much support our educational goals. But the other one would be the governor's bill, which spends a similar amount of money. I think it's the equivalent, slightly under a $680 BSA increase, but the specific ways that those funds are allocated may or may not align to how the districts are developing their budgets. So there is a lot of risk when it comes to projecting revenue when bills have not been passed at this point.
Member Wessons.
Could you speak to whether it would be easier or more difficult to build I'm trying to understand whether it would be easier to walk back a budget that, say, was predicated on a BSA increase of 680 or 1,000. Is it easier to walk that back at the last minute, or is it easier to build up staffing at the last minute?
I guess easiest for whom would be the things. Like for easiest for staffing would be to put it in now, but then at the end, if we don't get that money and then we have to go walk that back and tell people they don't actually have those jobs that we staffed for, then it gets really difficult for the folks making those decisions. Of course, it would be easiest for me to add that $1,000 now and not have to go through all these conversations with people saying, here's all these important programs that my kids use, your kids use, that are going to have to be cut. So I don't know. I mean, it's kind of, but yeah, it's really hard to put those in place, then walk them back, especially once you get past May 15th and that statutory deadline for layoff notices.
Mr. Chair.
Member Bellamy?
So this last week, I've gotten the same question over and over again. And I can't remember if I sent it in or not, but it has to do with this alleged property that the district owns that's been kind of set aside for schools. Well, we don't own it. But can you talk about really what that is, and that we don't confirm that we do not own that property, and that it is not up to us to sell it to mitigate the budget?
I suspect this similar to any property. We don't own title to any real property. The city holds that.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were to declare a property excess, such as the totem site, that would go back to the city and they just decide what to do with the property at that point. We don't get revenue from the sale of it, to my knowledge. I mean, I guess there could be some agreement with them, but there is none in place that would actually give us a financial benefit from them doing something different with the property.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Member Higgins?
Thank you. One of the issues that has come up, which I find somewhat amusing, is people take a little snippet of something and then use it in a way that isn't intended at all. And that has to do with the budget reserves. We have the proposal we have out there, and I want to get your input on this, is cutting it down to the minimum what we required to keep. So I have seen what the impact is with Mount Spur blows, and East High School has problems with its roof. I've seen the November 30th. I've seen a lot of different times insurance provisions that cost things and damages in schools. We don't have the reserves under the budget proposal we have in front of us. So my understanding is that one of the comments you made is that when we get additional funds, we've got to recognize that we don't have adequate reserves there and to put something in savings. Some people, including the legislature, apparently are saying they don't need money because they're just going to put it in savings. Let me see if I have this right. We're not going to add anything to savings. What we're talking about is taking less out of savings when we do the budget so that we are being responsible and we can respond to an emergency within the school district that requires funds, and everyone needs some emergency contingency funds. So provisions that arguments that we are have more than enough money, we just want to put it in savings is so I know people want to select certain things and make a big deal out of it, but any comments in regards to that? Is that a pretty accurate statement that we're not adding money to savings? What we're talking about in the final budget is to take less out so that we have enough for a contingency.
Right, that would be correct. And I think that was probably in on this slide that we presented at the work session last, which shows the impacts of HB 69 if that were passed as is. And really what it was showing is if we added back about $65 million in stuff that we had to reduce out of this budget, we would still be spending $23 million of our fund balance. That would get us down to probably a little bit over our 8% mark, which is about the board minimum currently. To get down to the 5% mark, you guys have to have a super majority to go below board policy. But really, I mean, that's that's all it was showing if we were to add back most of the stuff we've reduced this year for next year's budget, we would still be spending a significant amount of savings and getting down to that lower end of the board policy. And really, I mean, the 10% cap comes back into play after this year too. So there wouldn't be a mechanism for us to hold on to that money even if we wanted to, right? Because that's what's going to limit the amount that we can carry over.
And the chair would be willing to bring policy to governance prohibiting board members from using the term savings. It is fund balance. And I think it's also worth noting that we don't have a fallback, that if we run out of money, we can't turn to the city or the state. We do have to meet our budget every single year, and that is a factor in the fund balance that we try to maintain. Other questions? I'm sorry, Member Donnelly.
Andy, I know in your explanations of this budget, there were a small number of security personnel cut. Could you explain what those cuts are and what their potential impacts are?
So I'll take that, Member Donnelly. I don't know specifically which ones you're talking about. Let's try that now. I think that's better. One of the positions is a position that we recently added. We added few positions here to work on overall district security that go out and supplement some of the stuff that's going on in our schools with the metal detectors and that kind of stuff. So one of those 3 new positions is in the budget to be cut. And I believe if there was another one to be cut, it would have been around the metric. Do you have that?
I don't believe we cut any around the metric base.
I think that was the only one that we had in there to be cut. One from security. Now, one of the things that isn't showing up in this, we have 5 assistant principals in this that are being cut due to metrics. But there's also 4 that we're displacing because we're changing the A of A grant, taking the assistant principals out of that. And then there's 15 elementary assistant principals. So at the end of the day, we are literally cutting 24 assistant principals right now due to the 15 at elementary due to title funding going away. So there's a lot to do with security in our schools that are going away around those assistant principal cuts as well. But as far as security goes, I think it's just the one based out of here.
Member Jacobs.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I actually was on my list to ask about the assistant principal role and how we use it. I was touring Eagle River High School, I think a year ago, and was talking to Principal Helvey, and he indicated, and I hadn't heard it before, but I think it made sense in hindsight that one of the assistant principals at Eagle River High School was functioning, and part of their duties was the athletic director role that the district went away from at some point due to budgetary constraints and not being able to dedicate an FTE to that, and instead choosing to funnel resources into the classroom. And so we heaped that on another person's plate who maybe the job description doesn't specifically entail that. Could you provide context as to how ASD utilizes the assistant principal role? I think when I think of an assistant principal, or at least what mine looked like growing up, it was someone who sat in an office and was signing forms or something like that's. Before joining the district in this capacity, that was kind of my picture of what that might look like. And in practice, that isn't the case, but I'm curious if you could share more. Thanks.
So we have almost on every different level, assistant principals look different. At elementary schools, there's a wide range of things that the elementary assistant principals do. Many of the assistant principals at elementaries are half-time at one school, half-time at another school. So they're there every other week. They'll do things like working with groups, working on evaluations of staff, working with discipline, working with other behavioral issues, working, on the PLCs and working through looking at the different data and working with different groups of teachers. At middle school, they become a little bit of everything: discipline, sports, activities. It depends upon. In some of the schools have 2 assistant principals now because of their metrics with at middle school, and so those are sometimes broken up by alpha. Sometimes they're broken up by age group. Sometimes the principal will divvy out specific tasks for each of them to do, be it different committees, safety committees, discipline committees, special education, 504s. I mean, there's a plethora of things that they'd be doing at high school. Depending upon how many assistant principals are assigned to buildings will depend upon what kind of job duties they would have. Almost every school will have somebody in student services dealing with things such as discipline and behaviors and safety. They're the ones really responsible for emergency action plans and that kind of thing. Usually one is working specifically around curriculum and all of our curriculum initiatives. Some of those schools that have less actually will double up some of those with sports and that, maybe some work with the facility stuff. And other schools will have, if they have more, it's because it's just a mass of people in the buildings and the level of which, the complexity of which is just huge. So it just depends. We have a metric that we follow. It all comes down to everybody's responsible for school safety, student safety. And that's number one in all of their job descriptions is that safety piece. But all of them have all of the pieces of really running a school so it's instructionally safe, anything a principals has to do, those assistant principals are doing. And then at the end of the day, we've had such a turnover, especially at our elementary level with head principals. It really is getting people ready to be a head person once they move into that head role, because it's important and you're on an island, right? So I hope that answers your question.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
I'd like to throw in real quickly, having been in a building for a long time. As you mentioned, it's whatever a principal has to do. It also is whatever a principal doesn't want to do. And I'll just say there are days when you walk through the office, and I have seen them sitting behind a desk answering emails, but also there are days when every single person in the office complex has a student in front of them, and there's 5 sitting on that bench that is reserved for students that have a special project that day. They simply are backup in every situation in the cafeteria. And if the BPO is not available, they're cleaning up vomit in a hallway somewhere. So, I mean, it is extremely wide ranging. They're able to go anywhere and do anything. I do think a lot of people miss some of the critical roles they play. But yes, you had a follow-up.
Yeah.
Also did want to add for the board real briefly, when you turn your microphone on, it now puts you in the speaking order on my screen, and I can get you in the right order and know that I haven't missed your hand or anything. Thank you.
Just for disclosure in our record, I've been using that process since the last meeting to ensure I get to speak first. So thank you. Now everyone's on the same playing field. Thank you, Mr. Gustafson. It did answer my question. I guess a follow-up question in that vein. The ratio that we have for principals, where does it come from? I know that there's a national accrediting body for school counselors that suggests a ratio of student to school counselors that we are not in compliance with. I'm just curious if there's a similar body. I tried to find something online and I didn't. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. And then the second question I have, which is maybe a bit more nuanced, is my concern with eliminating those positions is I want to go in eyes wide open. I think we should, as a board, to putting more workload on educators. And I guess my question is either directly by, if we were to remove a principal from, or 2 assistant principals from West High and East High, which I think are our 2 biggest high schools, will that directly or indirectly cause a realignment of duties that ends with us asking educators to fill in any additional work? Or is it possible that we will either just eliminate some workload or allow the workload that currently exists between 5 FTE to be accomplished by 3 or 4?
So as a former principal of West High School, I would tell you that if, right now we've already recommended one cut from West and East both. Now, they have been outside of the metric the last number of years, just because of the high number and high incidence of behavior, the vast number of students in those schools. Once you get to a certain level, you just have a mass of people in these big schools. And if we were to take away 2 positions, I could see safety being an issue. It's important because of all the different measures that we have and people that we have in those buildings. Most of them have 4 security. The big ones have 4 security also, and that's not enough. I mean, some of these buildings, there's a quarter of a mile from one end to the other end of the building, and just making sure we're spread out enough. I would say that probably in today with a +4 PTR also, we aren't going to find people willing to step up and do those extra things. You're probably just going to have to figure out how to do less as far as the job goes. And I wouldn't know what that could be as far as at like a West or an East, because there's just so much. There's so many staff members that you got to be able to do evaluations well. You got to spend time. You got to be working with your educators. You got to be talking with them. And that probably will have some piece kind of drop off also. But yeah, we're concerned about those. But again, we also are really concerned about how many kids are going to be in each classroom too.
And I can speak to the metrics too. Those were developed, probably maybe 8 years ago with the previous administration when they came on. There wasn't anything defined at that point. So really how we did it was, here's the staffing that we have at each of these schools for principals, and kind of back into a metric from there, just so we can say, okay, now we have a lever to pull. If you, in the event you need to reduce staffing, do you want to go to 1-500 for principals, so you can kind of make that equitable jump. But it really was based on the staffing that we had in place at the time that the metrics were developed. It wasn't anything that I read on best practice or anything. It was just saying, okay, we have 4 principals at this school. How that's about 1-400 or so. So really that's kind of how they came into place, and just to be able to have kind of something you could adjust, because before it wasn't ever defined. And that's what the intent was to be able to do, is just define what that metric is and have a lever to adjust if we need to. And then of course there are going to be some that are outside of that metric based on size of the facility or school need.
Mr. Gustafson, you mentioned that title funding going away was a factor in reducing principals. Can you elaborate?
We have 15 assistant principals at the elementary level that are funded through title funding. And that extra, and it was because of rollover funding for the last couple of years. Well, that rollover funding isn't available for next year. So we don't have, and what's happened is in years past, we've had enough open head principal positions that we were able to hire enough to make it work. And this year we are not seeing resignations like we have before as far as head principal positions going. And so that's probably going to end up in some sort of displacement. And that has nothing to do with the general budget or anything. I just wanted to explain that there's a thing where assistant principals are coming back.
Member Lessons.
Thanks. I would refer Member Jacobs you to the Picus-Auden evidence-based model, which does share its rubrics, and that's 1 principal for a 450 student elementary school, 1 principal for a 450 student middle school, and 1 principal and 1 assistant principal for a 600 student high school. So those are metrics that perhaps we don't align with, but at least they exist, and there appears to be some rationale for those metrics that you can put in your pocket.
Member Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wanted to highlight something I think I heard, and I don't disagree with it. You folks are the subject matter experts, but I just want to highlight that what I think I heard, which is that we think we're going to lose capacity to do some things at our buildings due to cuts to building administrative staff that have the title of assistant principal, but really function as glue. It seems like the more I hear about their workload, but we aren't sure exactly what yet. There the full scope of what that might look like, and then what we think might happen is that we might experience some additional challenges with properly evaluating our educators, which I think is a pretty big factor in professional development too. And I know board members have keyed in on in the past as to ensure that we're helping educators develop, and that evaluation process should be a piece of that. I mean, professionally, that's how I check in on how I'm doing annually. And so I would hope that we're utilizing the process to the same effect. And so I just want to confirm that check my understanding there. And then the other question I guess I have is, if we were to reduce staffing further then, or if with the cuts administrative staff that are being suggested in this proposed budget, can administration say unequivocally that we won't be adding to educator workload by reducing these staff, aside from the +4 PTR? Are we sure this won't add to educator workload? And if the answer is no, that's fine. I just really feel like we need to go into the conversation eyes wide open.
I can't answer that question. There's every school's a little different in how they staff their assistant principals. And, we are this year we're removing the 4 academies at the high school level also. And so there's going to have to be some kind of reassumption of duties there as well. I can't say that unequivocally we won't be putting something on too with the deletion of some of these assistant principals. I'd hope not, but I can't say no.
Member Lessons.
Thanks. You've said something now a couple of times, and I just wanted to ask for a little more clarity. I think my understanding of the master plan for the academies of Anchorage involved utilization of some existing assistant principals at some of our high schools would become academy principals. And is what I'm hearing that's not happening? Can you please just explain what you mean by saying that we have 4 displaced principals?
In the grant that we have, there are 4 assistant principals. There have been. And we are looking at another way to utilize that grant to be able to support and promote our CTE offerings at schools. And so we needed to get that out to people now so that kind of at the same time as we're working on any of these assistant principal positions, we had to make that decision early. And so we're still working on what does that look like for 25-26 and 26-27 moving forward.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. This is not a question, but it came through in Board Connect, and I just thought it was such an important sort of set of bullet points that I wanted to read them aloud. We've heard a lot about the impact of cuts at the elementary school level. People are talking about immersion and Ignite and class sizes, and it's a very granular thing, I think, at an elementary school, and a lot more nebulous at the middle and high school level. But what I read from the administration in response to a board member question about the effect of the PTR +4 at secondary is that these are the things that would be eliminated in middle and high schools next year. Immersion programs at all secondary schools, world languages, primarily French and German, and all middle school world languages other than immersion, fine arts, including choir, sculpture, drawing, middle school band, etc., student government, peer mentorship courses, school business partnership classes, yearbook, math/CTE combined courses like Ampton algebra and geometry and construction, biomed auto teacher at King Tech High School, mechatronics, AP coursework, courses with less than 25 students would not be offered, co-taught classes like for special students in special education, at every level and core subject, credit recovery opportunities, APEX courses. And then the last two bullet points were that increased class sizes in PE and health would be evident at all levels. We'd see 50 plus students in those classes, and that all remaining classes would have high class numbers close to or beyond the PTR of 35. Is that list something that parents and educators and students can expect to see truly at every middle and high school? Is this a compilation of? Can you just talk about that list, please?
Absolutely. Member Lessons, great question. I'd like to add a bit of context to what preceded that list of bulleted points, which was this was in response to a board member question as to what are the different scenarios if this budget were to pass, how would that impact secondary? So from there, our senior leadership polled all of the different secondary principals and asked them, what are some things that you're considering? So it's very important to note that the bullets that were read off are not exhausted, set in stone, but it's a really hard look as to what's at stake if this budget is passed in the way that it is, aka if we don't receive adequate funding from the state to get us through this fiscal year.
If I could add a little bit, that's just a compilation of what came in from everybody. It isn't like all of immersion at every school is going away. That's just in some schools, some courses may have to go away. Some of them might be immersion courses, and as well as the others. It isn't like every school has a different set of classes that they're looking at, and that's the list of all the schools had.
And I guess this is a follow-up. The effect of passing the budget in a week from now is to initiate a principal's ability to act based on their school budget for next year. And that principal would then take action based on their staffing, their student body. And that's when these decisions would begin to be put into motion. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And once you all decide and vote on the budget, then we analyze what you've decided upon. We go back and look and make sure we know what things are cut on this particular budget, and then we act upon that moving forward in the planning.
Mr. Chair, I have one follow-up. I want to get back to an earlier question I asked about, is it easier? And that's maybe a not great word, but there are different effects for the different choices that we have before us. I'm curious about what the effects are on our overall revenue when you consider local revenue. So if we were to pass a budget based on $1,000 BSA, what would that do as far as producing or procuring local revenue versus a budget that is based in statute, based on a $0 increase, or something in the middle, like passing a budget based on a $680 increase? What does that do to sort of an ask of our local community?
Yeah, good question. I don't think that would have any effect on what our ask is going to be, particularly this year, because we are at what we've calculated as the local tax cap. So we're limited on how much we can collect by that. So this slide really did show how we calculate that out, and we are taking the most we can, and that's primarily because there's one is the $7.5 million shift from the state to the local taxpayers via the required local contribution. And then we're going to have an increased ask for pupil transportation to help shore up that, since that hasn't been increased since 2015-16. So we're asking for money in these other areas. Part of it's going to be required. Part of it's going to be optional to get kids to school. But that does take up the city's cap for how much taxes we can collect. Mm-hmm. And right now, we've taken as much as we can, I think, based on what our portion of that would be. There would be a scenario if the city decided to let us go above that, then we could potentially get more. But at this point, I think they're at the tax cap as well.
Member Jacobs.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So if we turn to optimism for just a quick second, assuming everyone still has that gear, if the legislature was unusually productive and was more effective than it has been in years, and was able to adopt and get consensus to adopt a BSA increase and adjust the foundation formula for the first time meaningfully in years. And the board adopts our budget, the status quo with minimal changes. When are the points of no return? I understand there's a lot of cuts in this budget, and so I understand that there will be a lot of, relatively speaking, small points where things are happening that aren't positive. But what are the broad points where we're entering into a time where a cut can't be restored, a staff couldn't be brought back? How long does the legislature have to get their house in order?
From the finance perspective, it's really not, I mean, as soon as they pass that, we can go back and do any revision we need to at the city. You guys can make the revised budget. I think the impact is mostly on our staffing component. I'd turn it over to Sven or Marty to more accurately describe that and like when that window is for getting the best folks in place.
Yeah, so typically we would start our staffing process right after the board approves or adopts the budget for the next year. We've intentionally pressed pause on starting that staffing timeline, just knowing how disruptive that potentially could be, in the optimistic hope that something will materialize out of Juneau that will allow us to, as Mr. Ratliff said, revise the budget and maybe reduce the number of proposed cuts that are in this budget. The sort of point of no return is probably May 15th. That's the point at which we have to issue any layoff notices for positions that we know we can't afford going into next year. We can recall those later, those folks, but just as a cautionary tale, in 2017, we laid off for just a period of weeks in mid-spring about 200 non-tenured teachers. We were able to recall them pretty quickly. And when we did, 32% of them said no, thank you. And they left the state, citing just the instability was too much for them, and they went elsewhere. And so that's something to consider as well. So right now where we're at is we're on hold for our internal staffing process, where we displace folks and consider placing them and voluntary transfers. And the hope is that we can get to that as soon as possible, because we have to go through that process first before we can get to new hires. And we will have a few areas of high need where we need to hire folks from outside of the district for next year. And the longer we wait on that, that pool is always diminishing as well.
Mr. Chair, can I have a quick follow-up?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to make sure that I'm capturing that correctly, because it was good information. So anytime between when we adopt our budget on 2/28 and then May 15th, with the recognition that as you get further away from 2/28, the likelihood that those folks are still present and available to come back to work is gone. Was that the right date and the right assessment of where we're at?
So 2/28 would be the soonest we would begin the staffing process. I'm not sure. You could rephrase the question. I'm not sure I understood.
Sure. So I guess
the nature of it.
my question really is I want to get when the point of no return is. What I think I heard was 5/15, and then what I think I heard also is as we get closer to that date and further away from when we pass a budget that removes an FTE. Adding the FTE back in doesn't guarantee that the human that filled that position, I'm thinking of a librarian or a school nurse, is still available and willing to come to work for us next school year.
So if we haven't notified them that they're displaced yet, we haven't taken any action as a district in that interim period. But certainly they may be aware, and considering other options. And so there's a high likelihood that if we were to adopt the budget as proposed currently, that a lot of folks would quote unquote see the writing on the wall and start looking elsewhere just out of concern for their position. And so, even though we've put pause on staffing in the hopes that more money would come, I think some folks would start to make those decisions.
Member Lessons.
I am looking at the room, which is not yet full, but I do see our director of immersion programs, which makes me, when I think about timing, I know that there have been some folks writing in talking about visas. for perhaps some of the immersion teachers. Is there a different timeline that they are working with that we would need to know about from an HR perspective or anything?
There's really not. Those folks that we hire on H-1B or J-1 visas are full-time employees. They're under the AEA contract. They're subject to all the same rules and rights that are outlined in the contract, and subject to the same displacement and potential layoff protocols. If we did issue a notice of layoff to someone who was a visa holder, then they would have to return to their home country, is my understanding, or seek employment with another district under that visa.
Thank you. I wonder if we can also ask the question in another way. If you need an immersion, as a language specialist, and you don't yet have them on staff, or that if you're a principal with an immersion program and you would like to continue to conduct business as usual, do you need to get your employee and visa hiring ducks in a row sooner rather than later? I mean, if you have an open position or a need to hire someone, I guess my assumption is that if you were that principal, you would want to source your educator sooner rather than later.
Having been an immersion principal for 2 immersion programs, yes, you would like to get it earlier. I mean, sometimes you find people that don't need to be on visas. That's like the bonus. And if they can teach in both English and the world language, that's even a double bonus, right? So you're out there looking, but yeah, the ones that need to have the visas worked on do take quite a bit of time. And Brandon is probably the one that would be able to answer that more specifically.
And I'll add to that, that's true as we go into the spring. The pools of applicants for any position start to dwindle. And that would be true of our applicants who might come to us on a visa, or somebody who might come to us from one of the teacher preparation programs in the lower US. So there is always a sense of urgency for filling all of those positions that we have to from outside the district every spring, because the longer we go, the fewer qualified applicants there are. We've also learned, especially with our J1 visa holders, that if we don't hire them by mid-April, they typically don't have the runway they need to relocate to Alaska. They have to arrive here and set foot on U.S. soil before they can apply for a Social Security number, which then allows them to apply for an Alaska cert. And in order for them to get all those ducks in a row so they're ready for the first day of school for student instruction, usually takes several months.
Member Bellamy?
Oh, thank you. Kept going to the bottom of the list for whatever reason. Going back to the APs, you said we're not missing, but we're going to be reassigning 24 of them. What are we telling those people now? And how are we preparing?
We're working on that.
Okay.
Kirsten and Marty are going through a process. Kirsten,
Okay.
do you want to answer that?
Sure, I can weigh in. So we'll have 2 separate processes, and Marty can certainly chime in too, but tomorrow we'll be meeting with those affected employees at the elementary level, and we're able to do that now because it's related to title funding and not our general fund budget. When the general fund budget is approved by the board later this month, then we will engage our secondary process and notify those employees that are affected by that process at that time. So 2 separate waves of meetings, one for elementary and one for secondary, but they're different timing because of the budget source.
Thank you. And that 24 is really mostly elementary.
15 of the 24 are elementary.
Member
Okay.
Jacob? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
If you have a follow-up, go ahead.
I just had another. I wanted to just get a sense of, without talking about negotiations, just kind of how are we situated to absorb? I mean, what's going to happen? Do we know? I mean, we're going to move forward with the process of negotiations. I think we're doing, is it 2 or 3? 2 or 3?
We have
Negotiation.
3 contracts that need
3
bargained.
contract, okay. And so we are moving forward with what we have already, and that's reflected in the budget, that preliminary budget that we have.
Yeah, we do have some modest increases built in those to account for some increase in wages and benefits. If that's the question, it's the AEA, the bus drivers, and the food service are the ones that are expiring.
So something is built into this budget for that, for both of those, to
Correct.
continue the negotiation.
Yep.
When will we know if it's enough?
I don't know that
I know
can
it's a
answer
bad
that.
question. I know, but I really, I don't know how to ask it any differently.
We have to let the process play out, frankly, to see where we get to know if what we budgeted is enough, frankly,
Okay.
or too much.
Member Jenkins.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, that last comment from Mr. Ratliff. Okay. So I want to go back to Mr. Lang, and we had a few conversations now regarding educator recruitment and retention. And one of the data points that I have written down in my notes that I think we knew, or rough estimation was that it costs ASD roughly $26,000 or so per educator to find and replace them. I want to confirm if that's roughly accurate, because that's going off of my notes. And then I imagine that cost has gone up, because I saw the figure from ICER, which I think estimated it to be $20,000 a few years ago across the state. And so I think my questions are, how much do we estimate it costs for us to recruit and train up a teacher in dollars? And then 2, does that cost estimate in any way translate to a librarian or a school nurse, or is it totally unanalogous?
So to the first question, after presenting to the board, I think in January, we had some dialogue around this number, and we went back and we recalculated it because it had been a few years since we had really looked at how we define that number and looked at updating any of the specific metric items. And so the total estimated cost now to replace a teacher in ASD is $29,375. That is an AEA member generally. We don't break that out by teacher, counselor, nurse, librarian related services. I don't think we've ever looked at it that specifically. So that's just an aggregate number in general, estimated cost for replacing a certified position.
I follow, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you. I think it's helpful to tie a dollar amount to the legislative and efficacy we have in our state. That an action costs us real money that we could be using to put into the classroom, quite literally. The other question I have is I'm staring a lot at the municipal charter, which I don't know is wise. And I understand that there's a provision requiring that we submit our budget to the assembly in the first Monday in March. Have we ever explored moving that? And from the municipal side, are there other reasons why that date couldn't be moved from a functional standpoint? Or is it purely that we haven't had an assembly willing to have the conversation about pushing that date further back?
Yeah, and I believe the date stems back to when they have to have the tax request out to taxpayers. They send the notice out, they develop the mill rates and send those out in April. So that means they get our budget and approve it the month of March and combine it with theirs to send out those tax notices. So that's my understanding of why it's in there on that date. If we were to move something, the city may have to change their fiscal year, because right now they're on a calendar year, and the state requires us to be on the fiscal year. So we don't have the latitude to actually change our fiscal year, but they might, although I suspect it's a fairly heavy lift.
Good follow-up. So I've heard a couple assembly members speak to their interest in changing to a fiscal year model versus a calendar year. Would a I mean, should we be considering having conversations, maybe adding to a future joint school board assembly work session, the topic of some kind of joint charter amendment that allows us some additional flexibility and then changes the fiscal year for the municipality? Because if we didn't have to adopt our budget by 2/28, the legislature could have some extra time to do their homework, which I'm hopeful would be helpful to them as they move forward in passing HB 69. One of the things that came up yesterday is that at Fairbanks, they're grappling with some of the same challenges on a smaller scale, but they've got extra runway that we don't have. And I'm assuming that their borough runs on a fiscal year versus a calendar year. I just didn't take time to look up 2 charters last night, so. I guess to ask a question, is that something the board should be talking about with our assembly, about considering that? Would that make our lives easier as subject matter experts?
Yeah, I mean, it would make it easier if we could push that timeline back a little. One, we'd get things more accurately, because if we get closer to completing a year of this budget before we try to put in the next one, just having more data around that is going to be helpful. And then two, like you said, seeing where the legislature lands, or giving them a little more time to figure that out. Because, right now we balance a budget within the first 2 weeks they're in session. You guys don't approve it for the next month or so, but it's balanced at that point. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely something we could explore to see if that could be pushed back. I mean, ideally, you just have something in statute that makes your funding more known and predictable in perpetuity. But if that's not going to happen, then any additional time we can get to have our budget prepared on our side would, I think, be beneficial.
One last follow-up, Mr. Chair. So is it fair to make an ask, or maybe the administration wants to take time to consider it? I'm inclined at this point to ask at our next joint meeting that we take this up. I'm trying to think from a functional standpoint who wants to lead that conversation. I feel like Mr. Ratliff is a great candidate. I assume he's pretty busy right now. And so if administration could take some time to consider if they're comfortable framing the conversation and the benefits, I feel like the assembly would benefit from hearing our support, but hearing from the folks doing the work why this would be helpful. That would be great.
Certainly could. I'd probably want to connect with the city budget department CFO to see what their limitations are on as well, because it's not something you really want to drop on them as something we really, really want to do. So it's
sounds like a great
yeah,
idea.
we can certainly have that conversation. I think it's probably worthwhile to do so.
Member Wessons.
Thank you. I guess I have 2 questions. One is following up from this conversation and circling back to an earlier question about the effect of, a 0, a 680, or $1,000 BSA ask. And what I think I'm gathering is that, given the scale of our related asks, really whatever budget we pass is not going to have an actual impact on the taxes that would be generated or levied.
Right. Since we're asking for about the max that we can ask for now under the city cap, even if we were to get $1,000 BSA under that local cap from the state, we certainly could ask for more under that, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to collect it from the city side, because they only approve our tax request and then our upper limit spending. The thing we might have to do is, if we were to get, an extra $70 million or whatever it is, we may have to go back to the city and ask for that upper limit authority to be lifted, but we can do that at any time. It's not sometime certain like getting those tax requests in.
Okay, excellent. And then the word optimism was offered a little bit earlier, and I'm going to take it and run with it. What would the cost, and this could be an RFI, but maybe sooner rather than later, what is the cost at this point, given our predicted enrollment for next year, of decreasing pupil teacher ratios to levels last seen in FY16? It would require a little bit of math, which is why I'm not asking it right now, but I would find that very helpful prior to the end of the week, if that can be done.
Certainly, I can get that for you tonight. I just need to run the model. So just going back to the FY16.
FY16 is before, based on my records, right, we had a PTR +1 in FY24. We had a grades 6 through 12 increase in FY21. We had a grades 9 through 12 increase in FY19. We had a grade 6 increase in FY18. And in FY17, we had an increase in K through 3 and 7 through 12. So I want to go to the Wayback Machine and see what it would cost to have class sizes, pupil-teacher ratios, which would shrink our class sizes to a level that looked more like the start of the 2015-16 school year.
Yeah, we can certainly do that.
Great, thank you.
I'd like to remind members, we do not have items for executive session tonight. So if we need to run long on the work session, we're able to. Member Jacobs.
Yeah, so a quick question. I think it falls under budget. I'm going to try and shoehorn it in here. I want to make sure we provide adequate time, not just in the work session tonight, but in our meeting for reset here. So I want to make sure we're providing adequate time for public testimony as well as the conversation for the superintendent report regarding our budget. Does administration have any heartburn about us moving goal monitoring to our next meeting with an agenda that doesn't look quite so daunting?
Through the president, Member Jacobs, I have no issue with that. We can reconfigure the calendar.
So, Mr. Chair, I would recommend and then ask if you're comfortable just asking for objection as chair. If any board member has real reservations about being able to engage in a more meaningful conversation regarding goal monitoring in a space where we aren't at the same time imposing on, over 100 families, allowing them to return home. I think we should consider postponing that work. It is disappointing because it is something that I know it is very important to us, but I think this is the one meeting where I think we should err on the side of prioritizing hearing from the public given the nature of the decision in front of us. Thank you.
I would support that change in the agenda if there's no objection from board members. We are looking at, I think, something north of 150 testifiers tonight. Any other questions during the work session? Seeing no microphones lighting up, thank you to our presenters and thank you for the clarifications. And we are adjourned from the work session.